Hello, everyone. Thanks for coming on a Friday morning, and welcome to everyone who signed on online. My name is Shana Horton. I'm the rules attorney for TABC. If you don't recognize me, I'm relatively new. I started in August. With me up here, it's Matthew Cherry and Thomas Graham. I'll be discussing the proposed rules that you have in front of you, and then pass it off to them to talk about the marketing practice advisory drafts. So with that said, let's dive right in. Rule 34.4 and 34.6, items 1 and 2, they go together. This 34.6 is designed to provide safe harbor to the holders of consumer delivery permits. This is implementing 5708A from Senate Bill 1450, the Consumer Delivery Permit Bill. Essentially, it's modeled after 34.4, which is the safe harbor for seller-server for retailers. So, but what we've tried to do is make it really clear that 34.4 is for seller-server, 34.6 is for consumer delivery permit, and ne'er the twain shall meet. You're either one or the other, and you don't cross over. With that said, I guess I can just read through what we are expecting of people, what you need to do in order to get that safe harbor. Essentially, we've asked that the permit holder verify that each of their drivers hold a certificate from the training that we plan to provide, or that they use an approved software application to make the delivery. That comes out of the statute. We also ask that they adopt written policies and procedures to prevent delivery of alcohol to a minor or an intoxicated person, or in an area that is not wet for that particular beverage. And they make sure that all of their drivers have reviewed that and understand that. And then there's this sort of similar provisions about the rebuttable presumption and affirmative defense that creates if you comply with all of those things. So with that said, are there any questions or comments or concerns, additional things that you think we ought to be asking people to do, or open up the floor on either 34.4 or 34.6? Come on up.
Marcus Schwartz, Bracken Schwartz. 34.4, fine. Only thing I would mention, this is coming from our enforcement attorneys, is regarding the 10-day administrative affidavit for seller server. That's not in the consumer delivery portion. We thank you for that. And we would actually ask, while you're contemplating 34.4 amendment, to take that out. So as actually said, don't need an affidavit, just notice itself is fine. So that's something to think about. And then on 34.6 B1B, talking about the requirement for software application use on the delivery, I would urge the commission to add in delivery of alcoholic beverages, just because these people are going to be delivering a lot of stuff that's not alcohol, and they don't need to run the software if it's not an alcohol delivery. That is it for my comments for these two rules.
Good clarification. Thank you. Anyone online have any questions or comments? All right, and if y'all think of anything, as always, I'm always here. So if you think of something after the meeting, or there's something you want to tell me that you don't want to say out loud to everyone here, you can always call me or email me. It's shana.horton@tabc.texas.gov. All right, so let's go ahead and move on then, if there's no other comments, to item 3, which is Rule 35.7. With this rule, what we have attempted to do is lay out what the app needs to do for consumer delivery drivers. we didn't want to tell people how to do it. We just wanted to tell them what it needs to, the functionality that it needs to have. And so essentially it needs to be able to access, we want them to be able to swipe an ID or scan an ID so that they can verify age through the driver's license or Texas ID. They need to be able to verify that the alcohol can be legally delivered to the delivery address, so wet dry status. They might do that using our data. They might have better data they can use. And then they need to be able to verify at the time of each delivery that the person does not display signs of intoxication, that the person who is accepting the alcohol has presented a valid current form of identification, and that person's 21 years of age or older. So maybe that'll be a checkbox or something like that the driver has to toggle. And then the app also has to record the first and last name and birth date of the person receiving the alcohol, the physical address to which the delivery is made, the type of alcohol delivered, and then timestamps for the whole procedure. And that's actually something that these apps for food delivery and other kinds of deliveries already do. So we're just saying, add the alcohol to that functionality. And then subsection D is really about how we're going to make sure that people's data is secure. So it needs to log things like successful and unsuccessful logons, successful and unsuccessful attempts to change the password, successful and unsuccessful actions by privileged accounts, attempts to modify, access, modify, and destroy audit log files, and successful and unsuccessful attempts to access, create, write, delete, or change user account details, directory, or other associated system resource. And again, that's just so we can audit and make sure that things are working as they should, and also to protect the data that is in that app. And then finally, not finally, we got more. The application has to be able to authenticate the identity of the user. In other words, you need to have a logon if you're going to be using this. It needs to conform to federal standards for encryption. We want the data collected to be stored for at least 6 months, which is long enough for us to audit if we wish, but no more than 9 months, because there are limits to how long you're allowed to keep that kind of data. And it needs to be stored in a manner that's compliant with federal standards. And we clarified that information that goes into these apps may not be marketed in any manner. And so it can't be sold. People can't sell data about how much alcohol you're buying at your address or anything like that. And then to specify that we will be performing periodic audits to verify compliance. This is one that, this is kind of a new area for us. So we are really expecting a lot of input from the regulated community to help us get this one right, so that it works for you and works for us. So with that said, are there any questions or comments or refinements that you'd like to see to proposed rule 35.7?
Marcus Schwartz, Bracken Schwartz. There's a lot of references, I would say, generally throughout this rule to alcohol. I would recommend you change that to alcoholic beverages, so you're not regulating solvents and rubbing alcohol. Point of clarification, valid current form of identification. You meaning, I would recommend, frankly, government issued photo ID, similar to, when you actually buy. Otherwise, will a tax return work? Does it need a photo? What's identification? For G and H, as to storage practices and marketing, I guess a bit of clarification. I think what that's meant in part to do is to address 10961, which is the statute on electronically accessing, info from a driver's license and what you can do with it, how long you can keep it, all that kind of stuff. I imagine some of these people with their apps might fill in data that's not related to what's actually accessed there. I don't know if you're meaning to restrict that as well. Sounds like you might be. but just kind of some clarification
For
there.
example,
Or, you had mentioned, John Q. Public buys 5 pints of Jack Daniels every day or has it delivered, right? You don't want that to sell, or shouldn't sell that. So I guess is anything entered into the system then kind of a black box and can't be marketed or sold?
okay, we'll
Versus like anonymous data,
Yeah,
market data that people would be interested
exactly.
in.
Because frankly, a lot of these companies, that's where they make a lot of their money,
Right.
is the data. And so to kind of, I think, and I'm not speaking for any in particular, but I just think that that's a concern somewhat, or could be a concern of them. So
thanks for
I think there can be some.
And we need some help on that language for the folks that are tied to that, so.
Yeah, let's talk about that more. Thank you.
If they're using the same app for like alcohol delivery as well as other food items, then our intent is not to try to regulate it all what they're going to do with data for their cheeseburgers or something. But if it is the app that's solely just for alcohol, then we would say that it applies. But we could easily we could clarify that it's just for the alcoholic beverage portion.
I'll keep that around. Thank you.
Anyone else? Anyone online have any questions or comments? All right, excellent. We'll move on to rule 50.32, which is item 4. As you all know, part of this program, we are establishing a alcohol delivery driver training program here through the agency. This is separate from seller server, but it will end up having probably a lot of the same elements. And what Rule 50.32 does is just essentially say we're gonna have this program, and that if someone and it includes what's essentially a safe harbor for the delivery driver, him or herself, that it's a rebuttable presumption that the sale or delivery of an alcoholic beverage to a minor or an intoxicated person was not made with criminal negligence if the delivery driver held one of these certificates that we're going to issue and completed the delivery as a result of the technical malfunction of their software app. That comes straight from the statute. And then provides that we may suspend or revoke a certificate if we find out that the driver is not 21 years of age or does not hold a current valid driver's license. We will at a later time be developing or separately be developing the actual content of that training. This is just establishing that we will have it in rule. Any comments or questions about this one? It's pretty straightforward. Oh, it says they're muted on here. Okay. Go ahead.
Marcus Schwartz, Bracken Schwartz. I just have one point of clarification. I think this is the case, but valid driver's license, that's not Texas only, right? That's envisioned to be any driver's license.
Correct.
Yeah, thank you.
So, hey, Joe, do you have a way to unmute Jacqueline? No? Jacqueline, can you type in your question and send it to us? Okay.
Yeah, we're just waiting on a written question from someone who's remotely attending. Regarding the marketing of information, what's the goal? What are we trying to prevent? This is, it's in another part of our rules and our statutes that we won't market data. So let me go back and try to remember where we pulled that from.
I can say initially part of it was we didn't want anything where someone would be utilizing personal data of individual citizens and consumers and then necessarily selling that to other businesses or mainly to other alcoholic beverage businesses in another tier, because usually that could be considered some sort of benefit that gets provided. We are obviously not very well versed in creating technological software applications for delivery. I believe there's a lot of companies out in the industry right now that are maybe a little bit better at that. So if anyone has any suggestions on how we could write some of this to make sure that we're not getting any data, just preventing data that the code would prohibit from being sold, but then also allow companies to sell and use data in a normal way they normally do, we're very open to amending and looking at this to fix that if anyone sees that it's an issue.
Well, I think mainly people.
Yes.
So maybe anonymizing the data might actually accomplish the same goal. Oh, sorry, the question was, are you trying to prevent the use of data regarding products or people? I think it's really more about anonymizing that data. Are there any other questions, comments? Oh, here's another one coming in. I have to type them, so bear with us, sorry. Oh, this is a good question. If the driver delivers and the customer that ordered is unavailable, does the driver return the product to the establishment?
Yes. And that's something that we're about to also address in a little bit more detail in our advisory.
Okay, anything else? Anyone else online? Okay, we're just flying right through these. This next one I bet will be even faster. Item number 5 is Rule 41.541, destruction of uninsured product after a natural disaster. This is, I'm sure, in response to Hurricane Harvey. Essentially makes it a little bit easier and after a disaster for an owner of maybe a liquor store or something like that to dispose of damaged product without having to notify us well in advance or anything like that. It kind of removes some of the steps that you normally would have to take or shortens the time periods. And then afterwards, and they can do that, they can, as long as they render the product unrecoverable, it doesn't matter to us how that's done. And then the affidavit, they have to submit an affidavit of the destruction, but that's not due until 30 days following, again, to accommodate some of the timing issues and everything that happens in a disaster. And then the licensee must retain the documentation so that we can verify compliance with the rule. Are there any questions about this one or comments? Anyone online have any questions or comments about proposed rule 41.541? Okay, well, that does it for the rules. So unless anyone has anything else on any of items 1 through 5, we will move on to the advisory. And like I said, if you have any thoughts later, definitely give me a call or shoot me an email.
Go ahead. Okay. Okay, so our next item up is going to be the Marketing Practices Advisory NPA 061, which covers delivery to consumers. So what spawned this was a part of the Sunset Bill, and it essentially went in and allowed a new avenue for direct deliveries to consumers. There's 2 pathways mainly. One specifically under the mixed beverage chapter for mixed beverage permit holders that also hold a food and beverage certificate. We see that as its own individual path for delivery that is separate than any deliveries being done if you're going to utilize a consumer delivery permit holder. So I think that's one of the main things to kind of take away from this is there's two options. Some of that will somewhat overlap. We're going to view everything that's being done with a consumer delivery permittee as following that track, and then everything just under Chapter 28 as not using a consumer delivery permit holder. So anytime a consumer delivery permit holder gets used, we're going to be applying everything under Chapter 57, and then everything else for the mixed beverages, if they're not using a consumer delivery permit holder at all, all of their provisions will come just from the new stuff in Chapter 28. Okay, so what it does is it allows mixed beverages, they don't have to get anything additional if they already have the food and beverage certificate, and they can deliver the beverages themselves, or they could utilize a third party, which can be an independent contractor, or it could also be the holder of a consumer delivery permit, and they will make deliveries on their behalf. Anyone that is going to be delivering alcohol has to be 21. The same would go for deliveries under the CD permit. For those, the CD permit holder can make deliveries on behalf of a number of specifically identified retailers. So that includes package stores, wine-only package stores, wine and beer retailer permit holders, wine and beer retailer off-premise permit holders, retail dealers on-premise license holders, retail dealers off-premise, and then mixed beverage permit holders as well. But I do want to point out that if you're going to utilize the CD permit to deliver for a mixed beverage, that does still require that mixed beverage to hold a food and beverage certificate. The statute does specifically say that they have to be authorized under Chapter 28, Section 1001. Okay, so I'm going to move on to requirements for completing a delivery. One of the main takeaways from this, I think, is normally for on-premises establishments, there's no requirement in the law that someone has to show an actual ID. The requirement is that you can't sell to anyone that's under 21. But this time what the ledge did for these direct to consumer deliveries is before the actual product can be delivered over to the consumer, they actually physically must show identification, and the driver has to check that identification and verify that. It does also require that they confirm and log that either on a receipt that gets handwritten or could also be electronic. So there's also limitations on the time for deliveries. What it does allow is if you're utilizing a CD permit, then as long as the driver is picking up beverages during the legal hours of sale, we're going to look at a reasonableness for amount of time that you could deliver to an area that is somewhat far away from the location that you're picking it up at, that may have you delivering after the normal hours of sale. As long as you picked it up during the normal hours, you can still deliver the beverage. Okay. I'm gonna move on to limits on where alcohol may be delivered. So deliveries can only be made to an address that is obviously wet for the type of alcohol that's being delivered, and it does have to be delivered within the same county, city, or town as the retailer's premises. If you are in a city or town that happens to be on boundary lines, the law does allow that to extend to 2 miles beyond the municipal boundary. What we do want to point out here, though, is that this does not allow to-go transactions. What it does is it requires the beverage to physically leave the premises and be delivered to the person at a location that's off of the actual premises. So it doesn't allow anything like a to-go through a drive-through window or something like that. There's also specific limitations on the beverage, the type, size, and the packaging. So if it's going to be delivered under the Chapter 28 for people that just hold the mixed beverage permit, it has to accompany food that was made on the premises. That's pretty standard already with what those permit holders are doing. A lot of those requirements they already have to adhere to with food just to get that food and beverage certificate. So this kind of extends the use of that food and beverage certificate. You're utilizing that properly. As long as you made the food there, you can deliver alcohol if it's going with some sort of dish that was made. For all of the other retailers, if you're going to be utilizing a consumer delivery permit holder, that does not require any sort of food to accompany the beverages. All of the alcohol has to also be in the original container that was actually sealed by the manufacturer. We do really want to stress that. So it's not where any retailer can go and mix a beverage themselves and then have it delivered. Literally, you could deliver the beverage in the same state that you got it from your distributor or your wholesaler. So they're selling it in a sealed container, and it's in the same way that the manufacturer sold it to them. That should just trickle down, and that's what gets to be sold to the retailer. And then so still under just the mixed beverage side of it, if they're going to be delivering distilled spirits, those also must be in a single serving size container that doesn't exceed 375 milliliters. So that should be just those real little miniatures. We do want to point out that the case containing those 375 milliliter bottles, that's what should be stamped with one ID stamp. And then the package store that's selling to the mixed beverage, they can individually, we'd prefer them to not individually stamp the bottles and just stamp the case. And that way it's easier for us to identify what was going to be sold through the new direct-to-delivery app. And then, as always, have the MBs, you'll need to make sure that you are keeping invoices with those ID stamps, and that there's not going to be any delivery restrictions pertaining to the container size for beer, ale, or wine. So those can be sold in just the normal amounts that y'all would sell them. Okay, so for the deliveries under the actual CD permit, the law does require that it has to be in response to a bona fide order and in an area where the sale of that beverage is legal. So all of the types of beverages that get to be sold under this, it's only going to be determined by the type of beverage that can be sold to that consumer for whatever area that they're in. So if your retailer, maybe because you're on a boundary line and you can sell a certain percentage of wine or a certain drink, but when you cross over, if that consumer is in an area where that is not specifically wet for that type of beverage, I think this really comes into play sometimes when you have the difference between the 14% and maybe 17% wine, and it may only be some areas. But the thing that needs to be looked out for is where that consumer is. It needs to be wet where it's being delivered. And then obviously you can only sell the types of beverage that you can normally sell in the area that your location is wet for. This also is going to now, I'm going to address kind of one of these questions about if the alcohol is unable to be delivered. So obviously you can't sell to a minor or an intoxicated person. So if for some reason the delivery driver shows up and there's a person there that appears to be intoxicated, or if they can't find anyone that is actually of age, what we are going to suggest is don't make the sale, obviously, but hold on to the beverage, try to return it to the retailer. If for some reason you were delivering outside of the normal hours of sale because you picked it up from the retailer on time, but due to how long it takes to get to the consumer's address, it's now after the normal hours and the retailer's closed, we need to have the CD permit holder work with their driver to track and log them holding on to that alcohol for, I guess, that evening. We are very open to any suggestions y'all have about how that process actually needs to play out in the real world. We haven't really put too many specifics for exactly how they need to do that. I'm only just envisioning that the driver at some point, because it's kind of late, may not have a spot to take those beverages back to. So for now, they really just need to be tracked and make sure that they're holding on to it. They're not giving it to anyone else. And then as soon as reasonable, they get it right back to that retailer, and that the retailer is logging that and tracking it so they know they got it back in inventory. I think one of the most probably interesting things for people here is the limitations on liability for this. So if you're going to be delivering and you're a mixed beverage with an FB and you're not using a CD permit holder at all, there are no real protections for liability with this. Everything is going to be on you as the mixed beverage permit holder. There are a lot of protections that get built in when utilizing the CD permit holder. So in doing that, the retailer, their responsibility ends as soon as they transfer that beverage over to the CD permit holder. So if employee or owner of the MB, literally once they place that beverage over there, their liability is gone, their responsibility is done. There's one exception to that, and that's only if that retailer decides to, through a contract, agree that they are going to be responsible for double checking and making sure that the delivery location is wet for that type of beverage. So I think that's something to really consider and make sure y'all know exactly what type of agreement you're entering into with CD permit holders and who's going to be the person that's going to be verifying that address that it's going to be wet for the beverage that's being delivered there. Okay, right now I'm looking at the bottom of this page where it's liability of the actual CD permit holder. So the CD permit holder is not going to be liable for the conduct of the delivery driver that's acting on their behalf. If the CD permittee has not directly or indirectly encouraged the delivery driver to violate the law, that's reflected in the rule that Shana just laid out. And then also the driver either holds one of the valid certification from TABC for the new training program, or that they complete the delivery using a software application that meets the standards set forth in the rule. So for the CD permit holder itself to have some limitations on its liability, you need to make sure, one, they're adhering to the rule and not encouraging the driver to deliver anywhere that would violate the law. And then also 2 options, either drivers have to be certified, or you're using a application for the delivery software that adheres to the requirements in the rule.
Or if you really want to double up, that'd be great. Just do both.
Yeah, that would always be encouraged. Okay, so last thing is liability for the actual delivery driver. The driver is the one mainly that's going to bear a lot of the responsibility here for what they're doing. So we would really encourage them to be mindful of everything, because this is a different type of scenario than delivering beverages to someone that's actually on premises. You get to view the person a whole lot more there. Here, you're actually going usually probably to a private residence. So ultimately, it's going to be a delivery driver that bears all the criminal liability. The permit holder may bear administrative liability, but delivery drivers will always be able to be held criminally liable for anything that gets delivered to the actual consumer. There is an actual protection for them built into the statute. So there's a presumption that a beverage was not sold or delivered with criminal negligence if the driver held a valid TABC TRAD certification, and the driver completed the delivery due to a technical malfunction in the software. That is one thing that when we were drafting the rule for the requirements for the app, we tried to make sure that we were requiring that it logged a bunch of stuff. That way there would be actual evidence and data that would be available to show and prove up for delivery drivers if that app did malfunction or something went wrong with it, so they could utilize the rebuttable presumption. And then we just also want to point out it's illegal to deliver to a location that's not wet for the type of beverage. There's also a defense to prosecution if the individual or the actual CD permit holder relied on publicly available data from TABC. I think everyone knows that our wet-dry information at the moment is pretty much a spreadsheet. That's mostly the only publicly available data that we have. So right now the statute does require, to get the benefit of the defense to the prosecution, to actually use the data from TABC that's available on our public website. It also requires that our information indicated that that specific address was wet. All right, so that is essentially this advisory that we worked on for CD permit holders and the new mixed beverage delivery. I'd like to open this up and see if there's any questions. Yes.
Kenneth Bessemer with the Restaurant Association. The section you have here about limits on where alcohol may be delivered, I think Senate Bill 1450 for mixed beverage permittees, the same restriction about the city-county limits does not exist in that chapter 28 as it does for the CD permit holder. So you may want to look at that. I think the city-county is expressed in Senate Bill 1450, but 28 just says can be delivered anywhere.
Okay, we'll definitely take a look at that then.
Anywhere that's wet. So especially in the metros with a lot of different little cities, and thinking like, Round Rock, Austin, I mean, that may deliver over the county line there. That restriction is not there in statute for if somebody's delivering themselves.
Okay, we will definitely look at that and see if this needs to be updated then. Thank you.
Good morning, David Edmondson of TechNet. The question of whether or not an application meets the requirements, the delivery application meets the requirements set forth in the statute, in the rule, is that something that y'all anticipate determining only after the fact when you're investigating an alleged incident? Or is this something you intend to try and approve every single time there's an iteration of a new version of a delivery application?
I wouldn't think we'd be pre-approving them, no.
Yeah, I mean, definitely after the fact. I don't think we've had a whole lot of discussions about pre-approving. I think at the moment that's hard to kind of tell if that's something that's feasible, just because we don't know exactly how many software applications are going to be out there. I mean, if we had an influx of over 100, that may be difficult to quickly approve. But I think that's something that we're open to discussing if it needs to be looked at.
Okay. Yeah, I would imagine just given the timeline for rolling these out and the constant numbers of iterations that come out and the updates that happen on a regular basis, that would be.
The goal was not to pre-approve.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
Okay, we've got some questions coming in online. Okay, 3 questions. Number 1, y'all see it? Yeah, you can go ahead and read it.
Which one is that?
The return of alcohol at a retailer
Oh, those,
location
okay.
is technically illegal, correct? If the driver has to return the alcohol to the retailer, how would that be viewed in terms of auditing?
In that case, we will view it as being allowed because in essence, you are unable to complete the sale. And under the law, there's really no other option for that driver aside from keeping the beverage. But at that point, it actually got paid for by the consumer because all the driver is doing is going and making the delivery. The consumer is making that order. So if someone is not there, we are not going to view the return under this circumstance as any violation of the law. And for auditing purposes, one of the reasons that we are asking to make sure that everything is tracked and logged is if audit goes out there, that will be identified and they will know that that's the reason that a beverage left a location and then came back to the location.
And Brian, just to clarify, it's not illegal to return an alcoholic beverage to a retailer location. The consumer can return alcohol, the retailer can take it back. It's up to the retailer and his policy as to whether or not he's going to allow it. So,
number 2, is the retailer responsible to ID the driver of the CD permit holder to make sure they are of age before handing them any alcohol? The law doesn't talk about that specific responsibility. It does talk about the actual age of the driver, and they have to be 21. So there's not a specific legal requirement for that. However, some of that I think will just really play out in exactly how they are interfacing with that CD permit holder. If the CD permit holder is an individual themselves, it'll be a good idea for the retailer to make sure. If it is an actual business that employs multiple drivers that get used, a lot of that responsibility is on that business. And the law, if you're going to be utilizing the CD permit, does specifically say as soon as that beverage is transferred over, the retailer has no liability. So the third question is, if a customer orders a specific item, i.e. a 6-pack of bottles of beer, but the cans are the only thing in stock, is there any problem with substituting what the customer ordered and adjusting the pricing, or will that responsibility land on the application holder? That's really not anything that we contemplate as specifically regulating in this context. If for some reason a specific item's not in stock, all we would ask and encourage you to do is just work with the consumer just to make sure that you're still providing what they are asking for and paying for it. As long as they would accept a substitute, we don't have an issue with that, and the law doesn't have any specific requirements for it either.
As long as the app is recording what actually is delivered, I think that's our concern.
It doesn't look like we have any other questions from online. Does anyone else here have any questions?
Marcus Schwartz, Brian Schwartz. One thought on the distilled spirits via MB and the stamps on the case versus bottle. I would just imagine that there are going to be retailers that might not necessarily dedicate a single case to only delivery. In other words, not have a separate inventory effectively. And so I think at some point they might just default and say, please stamp all these bottles just because we might use them at the restaurant, right? And in that case, I don't believe there would be any requirement, for instance, that after you effectuate an actual consumer delivery that you deface the stamp or anything, right? Because it's not empty, correct? Am I reading that right?
Mhm.
Okay. And then I guess my last comment or question to you has to do with the viability of drivers and the wet dry lines, the database. A lot of that stuff is, you yourself, just TBC itself, historically has said this data may or may not be accurate. A lot of it says it's partially wet, so how do you know what is the partial part that's dry for the beverage and not? Do you have any idea of how you're going to handle that, or when we can expect this map?
I'm not sure of a specific timeline for that map. I know it is in a lot of discussion right now. Some of that is difficult, unfortunately, because TABC doesn't, we're not the official holder of all of that information.
254 counties,
Yes,
tens
it's,
of thousands
yep.
of cities that all have their own. Aggregating that is a monster task.
Yes, and there's a requirement in the law that they forward stuff over to us, but we have no way of knowing whether or not someone did a local option election and didn't forward anything to us. And our data can only be as accurate as what we receive. I think the good thing is, though, under the law, there are protections as long as you're using our data. So as long as our data says that, you're going to be protected for that delivery area.
You know, the law did change though, and now we can take data from the industry if you guys want to give it to us, and it not be a benefit to the agency or some kind of bribe or anything else. So as a result of that, we were able to accept data from industry, as we're hoping to work with industry as this stuff has developed over time, and try to build maps of our own, working with the industry on that piece. So. Someday.
What's the next one?
I think the next one is,
You want to do that one?
yeah, what do we got left?
Outdoor ads.
Outdoor ads. Okay. So the next one's the easy one. That's why I'm going to do the easy one here. So we got outdoor advertising regulation changes, and essentially these are changes as part of the Sunset Bill. There were several major changes to outdoor advertising, but we've taken two different advisories, essentially combined them into one. The first half of this addresses the outdoor advertising piece for retailers. Everybody that didn't have a mixed beverage in the past was prohibited from advertising any brands or specials on their windows or anywhere really on the outside of their premises. So this advisory is just clarifying and knocking out some of the old advisories, saying now you can go ahead, whether you be a BG permittee, a grocery store, liquor store, whatever it may be, you may advertise in your windows now at this point. So this is just clarifying the new language in the Sunset Bill, which was actually, let me correct that, the Sunset Bill repealed a bunch of language in Chapter 108, specifically Section 108.52 that said you can have the word beer to go or beer on the outside of your building, but it can't be bigger than 12 inches in height, and you can only do it one time, and you can't say cold. All of those limitations are gone. We put everybody on the same page with the mixed beverage. The only prohibition you're going to have for outdoor advertising on your premises as a retailer is going to be pricing. You wouldn't be able to put pricing on the outside of your building unless you're a restaurant and you're taking your menu and sticking it in the window so that guests walking up to the door can decide whether they want to come in or not. So that's the first half of this piece. The second half is the billboard advertising part. We've always had limitations on billboards. You couldn't put a billboard within 200 feet of a retail premises unless, of course, you got a permit from the agency first to do that. And we had certain criteria that we have used forever in terms of whether or not we would issue one of those permits. Mainly what we looked at is, are you driving traffic to a specific retail location? So if you're a manufacturer, you stating, go to this liquor store right here and buy my beer, we would consider that driving consumer traffic depending on the content. We would also consider it to be an issue in the past if you had one retailer within 200 feet. But if you could come to argue that there were 12 and the billboard was within 200 feet of 12 retailers, we would issue a permit. So all of those limitations and restrictions are gone. We're not doing permits anymore. We're holding in place, let me correct what I just said. We're holding in place really two things that are going to be important here, and they're all really based on 10207 of the Alcoholic Beverage Code, 10215. We're talking about benefits at this point to a retailer. So when it comes to billboard advertising, the limitations of 200 feet no longer exist, but we're going to look at the billboard and say, are you benefiting the retailer? Which would be a violation of Chapter 102. And the way we're going to look at that is two ways. One, are you directing consumer traffic? So if you're a manufacturer, are you listing specific retailers or pointing consumers to a specific retail location? If you're doing that, you're providing that retailer with a benefit because you're directing traffic there, right? That's going to be one of the issues that we would write a ticket on. And if we did so, we would write it under Chapter 102 as a benefit to that retailer. The other piece of this and what this advisory goes into is the actual funding. So we don't want the content of the billboard directing consumer traffic, but we also don't want you paying the retailer to advertise on the billboard in his parking lot. So if you're an upper tier member and you're paying the retailer to advertise on his billboard, we look at that as a means of giving the retailer funding, a thing of value, you're giving him money, it's a benefit. So this goes into, and this is the same restrictions we've always looked at with regard to issuing permits in the past. If you're paying for a billboard and the money is going to a billboard company, that's great. If you're paying for the billboard, for the space, you're leasing it out, and that money is going into the retailer's pocket, we're going to consider that also a benefit under Chapter 102. Okay. If the billboard is on the retailer's property and there's a third-party billboard company that manages that billboard, and let's say, I'm just going to say Anheuser-Busch comes in and puts a generic Anheuser-Busch billboard up, and it happens to be in the parking lot of a large grocery store or something along those lines. If the billboard company that is paying lease money back to the retailer to be able to utilize that billboard and lease out space on the billboard to Anheuser-Busch, okay, if they are making enough money off that property for non-alcohol ads to be able to cover their expenses to the retailer, it's not a violation. Okay, and that's what this is trying to explain. It probably does a better job of what I'm doing here. Let me give you an example where it would be. So if I'm Mr. Billboard Company and I'm taking money from Anheuser-Busch and I'm giving all that money to the grocery chain, that would be a violation. Now, if I'm the billboard company and 6 months out of the year I'm advertising Apple and I got an iPhone up there and I made enough money off the iPhone to cover my year's worth of a lease to that retailer for whatever contract I've negotiated to use the billboard in its parking lot, it's not a violation. Okay? Does that make sense? The idea being, we don't want that money directly or indirectly being filtered into the retailer's hands. I know this is kind of a weird restriction, but this is something the agency's been doing forever, is with regard to billboards within 200 feet and people looking at retail or us issuing permits in the past. We looked at what the funding was, where it was going, and we told the billboard company and the applicants at the time, if you can cover the cost with non-alcohol advertising to the retailer for use of that billboard. Of course, this is not a very common scenario. With non-alcohol advertising, then it's not a violation. Another example of this would be if you're downtown Dallas and they've got the giant billboards on the side of a hotel. Okay, you guys have all seen those, are 150 feet tall or whatever they happen to be. Part of the year that billboard company is advertising alcoholic beverages. Another half of the year they're advertising, like I said, Apple or something else. They've been able to come to us and say, look, the funding that we received off the non-alcohol advertising covers our cost to the retailer for hanging this on the side of that hotel and what we have negotiated with them. In those cases, we can say it's not a violation because the retailer is not necessarily receiving that money directly or indirectly from that outdoor advertising paid for by a manufacturer. Now, if that sign was all year long, only outdoor alcohol ads, and all that money at the end of the year was going into the retailer's pocket for lease money, we would consider that a violation. So I know that's kind of confusion. I've spoken to some of the billboard companies about this language, and this is a standard language that we've used in the past when we've approved billboard permits. So take a look at it. Let me know if you have any questions specifically. Maybe we can make it more clear. Hopefully this in writing is a lot more clear than I laid it out here today. But it's definitely not a change from what we're doing now or what we have done in the past. It's just the big change is we're no longer requiring a permit if you're within 200 feet. If you're within 200 feet, we're not going to worry about it unless money is somewhere going into the retailer's pocket that it shouldn't be, or the sign is directing consumers to a specific retail location. Please.
Are you ready?
I'm ready.
Dennis
Fire away.
Hadley, Texas Package Stores Association. On the advertising piece, just a comment concern the difference between advertising and pricing. If an agent walks up to a retailer's window and sees the shelf and Tyler Rudd's Chateau Lafite Fifi sitting there, and it's for him $250 because he's a high-end kind of guy. Is that, I mean, to me, that's not advertising. That's the price of the product versus, hey, come in and buy, we've got this on sale for this price.
Right.
And I know there's a distance requirement there, but we just have some concern that you might have an agent come up and say, okay, I can see the shelf and I can see that, the Tito's is $32.95 or whatever. Okay. That's not really advertising. That's just what it costs.
Right.
So
Maybe we can add a line in there just as a note to clarify, which I think we can just follow along the way statute was about product itself and the labels of it are not considered outdoor advertising when they're up against the window. And some of that obviously has been wiped out, but we'll put that in there so that it's clear.
Okay.
Thank you.
Marcus Schwartz, Bracken Schwartz. This isn't necessarily goes to the rule or the advisory so much, and more to the other side of the house. So if you talk to Dexter or auditing, but with the now outdoor advertising on the compliance app, there's a question: is do you outdoor advertise? I would recommend getting rid of that next year. I realize some of those questions were done before the law changed, but that is otherwise going to cause a lot of work on the agency's part, and I think it would be a waste of time, frankly.
Dexter, you're here. You guys have been.
Yeah, we're aware of it, so we will be able to.
Okay. Thank you.
Anything else on the outdoor advertising advisory about funding? So the very last one here is an old advisory. And we're not looking to make any major changes to this advisory. It talks about delivery vehicles and the signage on the outside of those delivery vehicles. In the past, we've had delivery trucks parked in front of retail locations. We called them billboards because they were with 200 feet. We looked at it as a violation depending on how long it was there and how it was done. What we're doing in this advisory is just stripping out the 200-foot limitation as the law changed. So we're just aligning this with current law. If you look on the back page, we've stripped out mobile advertising, which is 200 feet within a retail location. We've removed that. We've removed that restriction that says you can't have a billboard within 200 feet, essentially. We're not going to get into, we didn't want to really open this thing up and get into what other pieces of legislation and direction it covers with regard to how you can advertise on the outside of a delivery vehicle. We don't want to make any changes there. We're just getting rid of the restriction that they can't be parked within 200 feet of a retail location without being called a billboard for over a certain period of time. So one of the things we are looking at doing in the long run is going through our advisories, cleaning them up, getting rid of ones that may not apply anymore, looking at some of the interpretations, and then also trying to reformat these things so they're more clear and well written, thanks to our communications team here, driven by Brian Black. But we will do that later on down the road. We're not going through all of them right now, so we just want to get this one out there, pull the 200-foot restriction out so it's not in conflict with the new law on the sunset changes. Questions? While we're here, and I mentioned Brian Black, stand up for just a minute so everybody that hasn't met you yet. Okay.
Look forward to working with any of you guys. So if you need anything, you can holler anytime. Thank you.
Okay. That's all I got.
We would like you up front.
We got you a chair.
Last one on the agenda is the following use for funerals and private events. So we've been at this for, I guess, a little over around 9 months now, and we just wanted to bring some more clarity to what private event was and what the following use was, the intention of the following use. And so basically that's all that this is, just bringing clarity for following use. So obviously the funeral is, there's no definition or whatever. A funeral is a funeral. So that stands alone for that meaning. So private events, bringing clarity to private events, that they're not open to the public, that there's no ticket sales or any kind of cost associated with coming to that private event. So, you know, I don't want to read this whole thing to you guys, but then we've also added in here some general requirements for record keeping. So when we go out to audit, this is the information we're going to look for concerning your private events. So invoices containing dollar amounts, invoices showing dollar amounts purchased and sold, number of attendees, and the agreement between all the parties involved in your event. So basically that's, you know, all we were trying to do is bring clarity, give some specifics on record keeping. So when auditors do go to audit these things, you know exactly what you need to keep and exactly what they're going to be looking for. Any questions?
And if you file one of these and you're not supposed to be,
Yes.
you should have filed 10 days ago, then what happened?
So if you file one and it did not meet the requirements of this, then you're subject, your permit's going to be subject to any kind of administrative actions.
And expediting fees.
And then any future ones, you know, you may be required to give us the notice so we can vet any future ones, just depending on the regions of what the auditors find out when we go to audit or receive any complaints.
Thank you. Any questions, comments? Anyone out there in Zoom land have any questions or comments on this one? All right.
Thank you all for coming. We very much appreciate it.